Good evening. My name is Michael Knock, and on behalf of the Mackin-Mailander Committee, I'd like to welcome you this evening to our lecture with John Moe. Thank you so much for joining us. The Mackin-Mailander Lecture Series was established in 1997 after Clark received gifts from Mary Mackin and Verna Slattery Mailander to establish an endowed lecture series. The lecture series throughout the year features prominent outside speakers, faculty, and alumni speakers. A few notes about our event tonight. John's talk is titled The Other Healing, Trauma and Mental Recovery After COVID. He will speak for around 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a few minutes of Q&A. And after our event, we do have some refreshments out in the atrium, so please join us for some punch and some cookies. The theme for our lecture series this year is the human connection. This theme seems especially relevant as we move through our fourth semester of pandemic. Since March 2020, we have been missing those human connections that come with seeing family and friends face to face. We wear these masks to protect those around us, but they also create problems for our human connections. I myself now know how much I rely on seeing my students' faces to gauge comprehension or engagement. John Moe is an expert when it comes to making this human connection. The host of the podcast Depresh Mode, John engages in honest, humane conversations with artists, entertainers, and experts on what it's like to live with what he calls, quote, an interesting mind, end quote. In this way, he has worked to destigmatize issues of brain health in a way that is approachable, interesting, and fun. In addition to his podcasting, John is also a writer. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, McSweeney's, the Seattle Times, and many other publications. He is also the author of a memoir titled The Hilarious World of Depression, a book that was named one of today's 10 best inspirational books of 2020. A graduate of Whitman College, John grew up in Federal Way, Washington, and currently lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. We are extremely grateful to John for joining us this evening to present our Mackin-Mailander lecture. So please join me in welcoming John Moe.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Clark University. I saw a tweet a while ago announcing that I was going to be here, and it referred to me as the award-winning podcaster, John Moe. And this amused my family. And they said, "Well, why don't you bring your awards?" And I said, "Well, I won a Webby Award for Best Comedy Podcast when I was talking about depression, which is sort of double funny." And they said, "No, maybe some other ones." So, I don't do a lot of talks in colleges, but just to impress you, I brought some of the awards. This is Best Dad Ever. My children acquired this one at the Goodwill and gave it to me on Father's Day. And then they pointed out to me, "Think about this, Dad. This means that some other dad was given this and thought so little of it that he gave it to Goodwill." And I said, "Thank you." A year later, I won the follow-up award, number one dad, best dad ever. So just so you know who you're dealing with, and that I have the bona fides to both be here and pronounce it bona fides. I just got into Dubuque this afternoon. There was a problem at the hotel with the printer to print up my notes. And so they had me send the notes to the hotel front desk, and the guy said, "That's spelled D-U-B-U-Q-U-E." And I thought to myself, find out what it means to me. D-U-B-U-Q-U-E. Take care, T-C. Suck it to me, suck it. And I didn't say that to him because he might not get it and might not print what I had. I might go back later and explain to him, and then we'll become best friends. I think sometimes about what it is that I want to say about this era that we're in right now in terms of mental health and in terms of trying to be connected and trying to in your case, learn from each other in a college setting, in a gathering of student and faculty scholars where you can learn from each other, and how you must be feeling. And the main message I want to get across is this stuff that's going on right now is not you. And the things that are probably going on in your mind right now, especially students, you're more stressed than you expected to be. You are more fragile mentally than you expected to be. You think more often, I just can't put up with this anymore. It's not you. It's not your fault. If you've gotten to this point in your late teens, early 20s, and you thought, this is adulthood? This is what life is going to be? No. This isn't the world. And you've been ripped off. And so if you feel kind of like out of breath, it's the world. It's not you. You're doing the best you can, and you didn't choose this. So it's not your fault. I'm a writer. I've written 4 books, and then I ghost wrote an extra book for a Vine celebrity. So I like to say I've written 5 books, 4 books in a spreadsheet. And they don't even have Vine anymore, I don't think. And they always say, well, choose your words carefully, and aren't there other words you can come up with other than swear words? And I know I'm in a college, but I can't think of any other way to say it, but shit's fucked up, you guys. Shit is all the way fucked up. And we're going to talk about that today, and how to kind of how to link the fucked upness of the shit with what's going on in your minds. Take it from me, the number one dad. 765,000 Americans are dead from coronavirus. People have lost their jobs, people have lost their homes. Life has been turned upside down. It's more than we can process. As a species, we've evolved quickly, but as an organism, the brain that we have can only process so much information. It's like, it's like dice. You can visualize 6 dots on a dice. Maybe you can, those special ones that have like 8 or 9, maybe you could do 9. But if I asked you to visualize what 25 dots look like, can't really do it. Then you have to start getting into abstractions as your brain tries to come up with ways to process the number 25 in any kind of visual depiction. Well, now we're at 765,000, and they're not dots on dice, they're deaths. And we can't do that. And I'm going to get into the reasons why here in a bit, but this is all happening in a way that is directly affecting you, because you have chosen a life of intellectualism, of scholarship, by being in a college, as a means to an end to get a job, or as a means of loving French literature, or whatever it is that you're engineering, whatever it is you're choosing to do, you're valuing knowledge. And we exist right now in a climate where anti-intellectualism and anti-science is bigger than we thought it should be. A friend of mine, the comedian Mike Birbiglia, said, you know who doesn't do their own research? Actual researchers. They team up together to do research. They don't go off and do their own. All right, so in regard to COVID and mental health, things have been horrible and are evolving to become more forms of horrible, new forms of horrible. And it's been going on longer than we thought, and it's got a ways to go. And I am very, very hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I ever expected to be. And we're going to talk about the horrible parts first. And then I promise we're going to get to the hope, because there's plenty of it. We are going to contain the enemy of COVID-19 after a long and horrible war, because generally, when society gets behind a cause of trying to get rid of something, they can at least make it a lot better, if not completely eradicate it. I'm no epidemiologist, but there's plenty of talk that the actual virus might be around for a long time. But, drunk driving has been around for a long time. It's gotten better because people set their minds to making it better. But when it is contained, we're going to have to deal with its ghost in the form of the traumatic stress that's left behind. We're going to be, all of us, at a higher risk for mental disorders. Our daily functions will be affected, and it will be this way for many, many years to come. And there's a dire shortage of mental health professionals to help us out. That's the future. And I am hopeful. I'll get to that, I promise. But it's a little like that show Stranger Things on Netflix. I don't know if any of you have watched it, but it's this Netflix show with these poor kids who, all these monsters from another dimension keep busting into their town and chasing them on bikes or something. I haven't watched it very carefully. But over and over, and these kids never leave this town like they ought to. And then there's another season, and then there's more monsters chasing them around on bikes. And I watch that show and I think, at the end of that season, that monster's vanquished. I know there's more to come. And I always think those kids are going to be in therapy every day for the rest of their life, if they're lucky, because of the trauma. And I explained this to my 19-year-old daughter who I was watching this with. And she said, Dad, you don't have to talk about mental health all the time when we're watching Stranger Things. I think she's really happy with that. But the thing that we're going to face is trauma, and so I'm going to talk about trauma a little bit. Let me illustrate what it is. I mean, shortly spoken, trauma is when we're up against something that our brains are unequipped to process, something so horrible that we just have no way of running that through the system. When I was 9 years old, my best friend shot me in the chest from point blank range. Small caveat, BB gun. Dean and I had this allegedly unloaded BB gun that belonged to my older brother. And because we were smart, here's what we were doing. We were pumping it up like 7 times, getting the compressed air in there, and then shooting each other in the chest with it, just to kind of feel the blast of air and go, oh, like that. And then we did that back and forth a few times. Put the BB gun down, went and did something else for a few hours, came back. In the intervening time, my brother had picked up his BB gun and went and probably shot army guys out in the backyard or something, and brought it back in. We didn't know that there were now BBs in the gun, so when it was pumped up and shot into my chest, it felt different, and there was a trickle of blood going down my Hanes t-shirt. And I was hustled to the car and then hustled to the hospital, and my best friend was wondering if he had killed me, and I was wondering the same thing. And x-rays were taken, and it was shown that the BB had lodged in some muscle tissue close to my heart, and it's still there. It's fun to have MRIs. And the belief, I don't know if this is true, but the belief became that if he had moved the gun an inch to the right, I'd probably be dead. And after that, I stopped touching BB guns at all. So fast forward to my early 20s. My older sister had 4 kids, 4 boys, all within like 6 or 7 years of each other. Densely packed clump of boys, which of course turns them into sort of a military unit. But my sister is a pacifist, and she doesn't give the boys any toy guns to play with. She doesn't believe in that. And so the boys will pick up sticks or carrots or celery and say, "This is my shooter." And so it was a good lesson that boys denied guns will invent guns. And so they would come after their favorite uncle, their still youngish uncle, and say, hey, let's play, we're going to play shooters, we're shooting at you. And it terrified me that they had these sticks. And I said, no, don't point those at me, because as soon as they said we're going to shoot you, I felt something in my chest. And I felt afraid, and I felt like I was about to die, because that's what my body told me to do. If you're going to get shot, this is what happens, because the body remembers, the muscles remember. The part of the brain that controlled those muscles will always remember that huge event. So I say, no, don't point that at me, And so I would walk away from them, which of course, they're like 5 years old. They come chasing after me more. It's fun, he's running away. No, we're gonna shoot you. We're gonna shoot you with our shooters. And then I would finally turn on them and say, get those things away from me. And they would cry. And I'd kind of cry a little bit, because those were sticks. That was harmless. But I've never been able to be around toy guns. And I'll know completely logically that a toy gun poses no threat to me. But the body doesn't always work in terms of logic. Right now, we're all being shot with that BB gun, right? Right now, we've been living in a world where, for a while, a deadly virus was floating around. For a while we didn't even know, is it droplets? Is it like air in general? How is this thing transmitted? Could it be on food? Could it be on door handles? We were proximate to the prospect of death. I don't want to phrase it as we were close to death, but it was in the conversation, right? And in 10 years, 20 years, if you see 20 years after COVID, as we know it today, has passed, you're going to see these masks, and those memories are going to come flooding back. That little piece of fabric is going to bring back all those memories, and your grandchildren will laugh at you. That's going to happen, because the grandparents who lived through the Great Depression, they'd get laughed at all the time for picking a penny up off the ground when they didn't need a penny. Or a friend of mine said that her grandma lived through the Depression and saved pizza crusts. Like, if anybody was going to throw away their pizza crusts, grandma would pick them up and put them in the freezer, because you might not have bread anymore tomorrow. Of course you were going to have bread tomorrow, but that's trauma. So we're going to get ready for that a little bit today. Here are some things that I'm not. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a clinical researcher. I'm a person who's dealt with trauma, BB gun and otherwise. I'm a person who's dedicated pretty much my professional life to the idea of having conversations about mental health, of talks about trauma, depression, panic, anxiety, stress, and then telling those stories to try to open a dialogue and separate fact from myth. And I'm a person who's tried to help his family get through it, including 2 college-age kids. I got into this line of work. I got into the line of talking about mental health because in 2007, my older brother died by suicide. And that happened because he had been having mental health problems for years. He was in recovery from substance use issues. He had horrible depression, and he thought that it was a failure on his part. My brother Rick thought that if he was really tough, if he was a man, he could get through this. Which is like breaking your leg and being told to walk it off, which I think probably has happened at soccer practice for some people. So he died, and I thought, I was at his service, and I thought, okay, he felt like he had no one to go to talk to about this stuff, and he felt like he was all alone, and that nobody else was feeling what he's feeling, even though it's incredibly common. I need to start making more noise that this stuff is common. More people got to start knowing about this stuff. The pain that you're going through as a young adult right now, and I'm speaking to students directly, I'm speaking to the college community to know this about students, the pain is being replicated all across campus and across campuses all across the country. But it's so weird feeling, it's so peculiar feeling that you might think nobody else is going through it. And it's scary, and so you might just want to keep quiet about it. And that's your prerogative. I think it's a mistake. I think you could go talk to someone about it. But even if you don't, I want you to know that you're not so special. Anything that you're going through, someone in the same dorm is probably going through it, whether you talk to them about it or not. All right, so let's talk about what trauma is. Trauma is an emotional response to a catastrophic event that's too overwhelming for a brain to make sense of, so the brain just sets it aside. This can be a jolt of an event, like a physical assault, car accident. Those are the things that we most commonly associate with trauma. And that is a type of trauma. It's a type of trauma called acute trauma. There are 3 types. Acute trauma, which isn't cute at all. Acute trauma. Chronic trauma is the second type, where a similar type of traumatic event happens over and over and over. An abusive situation in the home is a chronic trauma, right? If you've got a parent who does it over and over again, or a sibling or something. And then, so that's chronic trauma. Then there's complex trauma, and this is the one that I've been paying the most attention to in light of COVID. Complex trauma is multiple and varied traumatic experiences over a long period of time. So think about like an alcoholic parent. It's not always the same thing. One night it's not knowing where the parent is. Another night it's worrying that the parent won't show up to your school thing, or worrying that they will show up to your school thing. Varied manifestations that rot away your sense of safety, that create a sense that anything could be very, very dangerous at any time. And I think that's where we are together, because these fundamental underpinnings of being able to see each other and speak to each other right into the face parts has been taken away. Trauma of all sorts messes you up, but it's a case where the complex trauma is a little bit different. So for acute and chronic trauma in the short term, it can sometimes result in denial. Like something is so huge, the person could just say, oh, I'm fine, and that's the body kind of storing it away for a long time. With complex trauma, and see if this sounds familiar, the most common expressions of it, the most common results of a complex trauma, trouble maintaining healthy relationships, performance issues at work or at school. There's a lot happening in the economy right now, a lot of things that affect jobs that people want to take and will take. And yeah, there are supply chain issues in ways that I don't quite get, but in August, more people quit their job than any other month in American history, because the job just stopped meaning anything anymore. And that is a common result of complex trauma. So we're already seeing it in our society and in our economy. We've been in this prolonged period where things are just busted, things are broken, and we kind of have to pretend that they're not. Now, important caveat here, trauma is an individual phenomenon. We handle things differently. Some people are going to be okay, the bastards, and others, it'll be more of a challenge. Some people used COVID to go out and write operas and start new social networks, and some of us just sat around in our sweatpants and watched the Marx Brothers. Therapists that I know, doctors that I know, are telling me when I ask them, which is often, that what they're seeing now in society is consistent with trauma, with complex trauma. So let's talk about what's already happened, what's been happening. Things shut down fast in March of 2020, and the first thing we did is we got very unreasonable about toilet paper. First thing out of the gate. And when you think about it, it was a protective response to our bodies and the most delicate and sensitive parts of them. In March of 2020, my daughter wondered if she was going to be able to do all the things in the summer of 2020 that she had planned. She was going into her senior year of high school then, had all these great summer projects and camps and things. And I said, oh, it's going to be over in a couple weeks. Don't worry about it. And, she's asked me for that specific quote so she could tell her therapist later on about what her dad said. And then we lived like that. And we've been living some variation of it ever since. And it's really hard on you guys. The CDC did a big comprehensive study a ways into COVID asking, how are you doing, everybody? Tens of thousands of people were asked about this. Big project. And America said, we're not doing so great. 42% of responders had clinically significant depression symptoms that rose to the level of a disorder. Before COVID, it was about 11%. Beyond emotion, beyond feeling bad, the impairment affected function. And a disorder, it's not that mysterious a term. All a disorder means is that it's interfering with your day-to-day life. There's no chemical threshold you need to reach. It just means it's messing with you and you can't live the way you want to live. The survey said that anxiety, depression, trauma, all were up, and really way, way up relapse from substance issues. Those are the big 4 complaints. Biggest age group showing negative side effects, 18 to 24-year-olds. People whose adult lives were just getting started. And they got to these adult lives, and then this was what we were offering them. And they said, this is some bullshit. And we said, yes, we're sorry. Besides 18 to 24-year-olds, the groups affected the most strongly: people of color, essential workers, people who had to go out and work anyway, unpaid caregivers, people taking care of an older relative, and young women were affected more than young men. In 2020, people of color had been through a year where there has been new and vivid examples and illustrations of a society that was already stacked against them. Then they had COVID on top of that. Essential workers risking their lives to earn a paycheck, that messes you up. And women in a society where they don't get paid fairly in relation to men already, and have more safety issues than men already, have a brand new safety issue to worry about. So, what comes next? Well, fortunately, as some departments here can tell you, we can learn from history. Not as an exact description, not as an exact prediction of what is bound to happen, but more like a weather forecast. We can say when these elements are happening, this is the weather that tends to follow, right? And yeah, the weather forecast does call for storms. We know that other epidemics and pandemics, suicide rates go up, especially among the most vulnerable populations, like the populations I've already talked about. You could look at Spanish flu, Ebola, SARS, bird flu, places of the world where those were affected the most. When you look at risk factors for suicide, they're blaring right now. Substance use is up, we know that. Relapse is up. We know that alcohol sales have been through the roof since the pandemic started. Economic stress is associated with higher suicide rates, and businesses are closing, and there's been tremendous economic stress. Social isolation is associated with increased suicidal thoughts, which we call ideation. And the main public health strategy has been distancing each other, which is a great idea in terms of the virus, but really destructive when it comes to what we need, the nutrients that we psychologically need to gather from each other. Participation in religious communities and college activities helps your mental health, and those have been taken away. Interestingly, rates of suicide overall have gone down during the pandemic, which is good news if you just read that headline and don't read anything else, and you don't read that among young people and Black and Hispanic people, they're going up. And suicidal ideation, thoughts of suicide, way up, which is ominous. There is hope to come in this speech. I promise you, I will get to it. We're in a state of bereavement, if we've even started that state of bereavement yet, after so many funerals attended by Zoom and deaths observed on iPads. The mental weight of bereavement. The National Academy of Sciences says that there is a number called the Bereavement Index. And the Bereavement Index is the number 9. And that number refers to the relatives, sort of first circle relatives, parents, children, siblings, grandparents, who will be affected by a death. And so to the point where it affects that person's ability to function in society. So you get the 750,000 odd deaths, multiply that by 9. That's people who are damaged, in doing their work. And that's before we get to friends and coworkers and the secondhand trauma of just the people, working in hospitals, working in healthcare, who are trying to deal with that. We know that after the immediate threat has passed, and this will pass, that people affected by trauma disorder hyper-experience the trauma that they had. So the mind plays it back. The car crash, the pandemic, the assault. The mind keeps playing it back because the mind says, maybe if I just keep trying, I'll figure out what the hell happened with this. And when that happens, the body keeps the score, and the body reacts to it. So, and it does that with the fight, flight, or freeze response. So if there's a cookout, there's a loud noise outside, one person dives to the floor, maybe that person has been in a combat situation, in a war. Home from overseas, but the body kept track of what it experienced. The brain said, like I mentioned before, this is what you do in that situation. Or the body is threatened. Something happens that sends a message, I am under threat. So maybe there's a fight response. Maybe there's a freeze and don't do anything kind of response. And reflexes remain past their utility. So anxiety, if it's an anxiety disorder that developed as a kid, often it was really useful when it first came around. If you've been in a dangerous relationship, if you've been in an unstable home as a child, you know that anxiety can really be your best friend. If something is happening that could affect you, and it could be a danger, you tune into it. Similarly with depression, if a situation is hopeless and you're depressed, it could be your brain's attempt to have you not feel as much and make the damage less significant. The trick is, after those threats have passed, to no longer see these things, to see the world as something that you can't handle, that to open yourself up out of the depression, to let go of the anxiety. And that's what a lot of people spend the rest of their lives not being able to do. So I think we can expect freakouts post-COVID. We might be triggered by things, and I know trigger is a word that gets co-opted and made fun of by jerks, but it's true. Something that, I don't know if you've had this experience where you're watching a movie that was made 10 years ago, and there's a scene like in a nightclub, and everybody's talking and breathing on each other, and you go, oh, put on a mask. It's illogical, it's irrational. You know that this movie is a movie and it was made before all this, but that's going to keep happening to you, I think. there will be grief that people still have to process, and it's still going on. And let's talk briefly about people who are going to be here to deal with it. If you have been spending your time in college getting ready to become a psychiatrist or a therapist, there's going to be plenty of work for you. You have some economic security coming your way. Your schedule will be full. If you do not have a therapist, if you do not have a psychiatrist, try to get one after this speech, maybe out in the lobby while you enjoy those cookies and that punch, because there's going to be a run on them. So this is all happening too in a world where burnout is more an issue than ever before, because what's happening now is that employees are being asked to do just as much as they did before the pandemic with fewer resources and often from their own homes. So all the boundaries are getting crushed and stepped on, and people are trying to manage their career and manage the demands of their bosses while also trying to manage their families. And 83% of workers actually report enjoying work less since the pandemic started. I don't know who those 17% are that are just fine, but I'm going to apply to their companies. Okay. Oh, and then I got to mention this because this cracked me up. So then what a lot of employers are doing to address burnout, the bosses are saying, well, okay, we'll give you an app, or we'll give you 2 free therapy sessions. It's on us, because they are trying to turn the issue of burnout into the employee's problem. They are trying to do the same thing that society has been doing with mental health for, as long as any of us have been around. They're not addressing the problems endemic to a job that someone needs to have in order to have a home and a life in this society. They're saying, well, maybe, if you're burnt out and if you're going crazy at this job, you should fix that. Because the employers aren't willing to say we should fix that and create a better system. Amazon actually had this a mental health program where they had like little apps that all their employees had to keep track of their mental health, to see just how stressed out they were. And then they canceled that because they said that people didn't seem to be getting any better. So they just took away the small token things that they had already offered. I used to work at Amazon a long time ago. I'm glad I don't anymore. I wish I was rich, but I'm not. So it's the level of situation right now that made Greta Thunberg famously say, I want you to panic. And I don't want you to panic. And one, because if you talk about mental health, advising someone to panic is bad policy. Two, because Greta's Swedish and I'm Norwegian, so I can't possibly agree with her on things. But I do want you to be ready to protect yourself and your family and those close to you. Consider getting to a therapist. Even if you don't think you have a mental disorder, consider bringing the car in for a tune-up. We're under more stress than we've ever been as a society, and we're all smiling and going to class and taking notes, and it's crazy. The seas are boiling out there. And a therapist can just give you a little tune-up to say, okay, let's figure out what kind of brain you have. All right, how's that brain working for you? What kind of trouble are you getting into with it? What kind of thought patterns are in it that aren't especially helpful? You might not be, capital D disordered in your thinking, but for God's sakes, get the help that you can get if you can get it. And take advantage, especially at a college, take advantage of what is available to you. My son goes to St. Olaf College, and the guy gave a speech there about going there, and his dad saying, make sure you drink plenty of orange juice. And he said, why drink the orange juice? Because it's paid for. It's included in your meal plan. just drink as much orange juice as you can because it's already paid for. So go to as much therapy, as much counseling as you can because it's already covered. I was at an event and someone said, well, what's the best way to handle the panic attacks that I have as a result of trauma and stress? And from things that have happened to me. And I said, well, I'm not a therapist and I'm not a doctor, but go to one of those. Don't try to figure it out on your own. We're in a situation where it's kind of like, if a light bulb goes out in my house, I can screw in a new light bulb. If sparks are shooting from the walls, that's when I call an electrician, because I am not prepared to handle that on my own and I could get hurt. A friend of mine said, the big thing to do right now is to handle yourself with kindness. Recognize that you've been through some things. Recognize that it sucks. And if your friend has been breaking down about the stress of what's been going on, you probably wouldn't say to your friend, well, maybe you should just be tougher. Maybe you should just get over it. No, you'd say, oh man, it sucks. I'm so sorry. You'd sit with them for a while. Try to do the same for yourself. So here's the big leap that we're taking. And this is the part where I get to the hope. We know that we are in the midst of trauma right now. We know that it's not you, it's them. It sucks that you have to wear masks. Some of you are wearing masks more than others right now. Some of you have the kind of over the nose, over part of the mouth, but not the whole mouth thing going on. We're all on a journey, I understand. Take it from me, the number one dad. But we know what we're up against. And I am here to tell you that it's going to stay with you for a while. And when the numbers go back down and hopefully stay back down, you might think, it's all in the past. And maybe you're one of the lucky people for whom it will be, but probably not. You're going to carry this with you for a long time. This isn't what college was supposed to be. You should have been making out with more people. It's hard with masks on. We all know this. He's saying what we're all thinking. He really is the number one dad. But we've never been more connected. We've never been more ready and more willing to talk about it. We've never been more ready and willing to address the subject of mental health. There's never been more of an assault against stigma than there is right now. I used to cover technology, and there was interest in technology. When I started covering mental health, suddenly doors flung open for me, not because I became a much better host or reporter or writer, but because people were starving to talk about it. In the 1970s, a few people in this room might remember, our parks just looked like ass. Like you would get done with your McDonald's or whatever, and you just throw the wrappers on the ground in the park and walk away. People just did that. People, there's garbage in my car, I'll just throw it all out of the car while I drive. People still do that. We can never defeat jerks. But we all got together and we said, let's do something about this. Let's cut down on litter. Let's make it not okay in our society to litter as much. We got somebody dressed up as an owl. There were some PSAs. It was awesome. And it kind of worked. In the 80s, when I was learning to drive, there was the big push against drunk driving. And it made perfect sense to me. And they explained to my generation of people learning to drive, if you do this, you're a lot more likely to kill people. And we all said, we don't want to do that. And so it got better. It hasn't gone away. It may never go away, but it got a lot better. Cigarettes, same thing. Same thing is happening right now with mental health. and it's very promising. And not only are people more willing to talk about it, there's more ways to talk about it. Teletherapy is here. It's been deregulated, and it's never been easier. And what this means is that normally 70% of therapy appointments, the person shows up. So 30%, nothing gets done. Everybody is just out that block of time. With teletherapy appointments, it's close to 100% attendance because people are in their homes. It also means that if you have some weird thing that, I don't want to say weird thing, there are no weird things. If you have a mental health situation that's a little unusual and requires a specialist, and you live in Dubuque, maybe there's somebody in Cedar Rapids who specializes in that thing, and you don't have to drive to Cedar Rapids. You can just be connected. State to state, it gets a little trickier, but maybe that barrier will fall also. We can figure out the best ways to be close to each other. We can figure out alternative ways to be close to each other and gather those nutrients. Let's be careful about being the ways that we're close to each other, because sexually transmitted infections are also way up during COVID. It's just one of those things. Tinder has never been more popular. But we can know the threats. We can know that the tsunami of the effects of trauma are coming, and we can know what our response is. We can spot it in our muscle reactions. We can spot it in our emotional health. So we're in the middle of, and I used to say tidal wave, but it's a tsunami and not a tidal wave, because the oceanographic difference. Tidal wave tends to be a single huge event, and then it recedes. A tsunami is just this horrible thing that just keeps rolling. It's lower, and it just keeps pushing, and it goes on for a lot longer. So that's what this is. But we can get to higher ground if we know that it's coming. So the threat has never been larger, and our preparation to meet that threat has never been stronger. And most of the hope that I get from that, and I'm very much off script at this point, but I'm about to wrap up. And isn't it great that I had no PowerPoint slides? The hope that I get is from you guys, from the students, from young people. I have one kid at a college in Washington, one kid at a college in Minnesota. I've gotten to know a lot of their friends, and I've talked with a lot of them. And you have a better perspective on mental health and less baggage, less bullshit stigma about it than we did. I mean, I'm Generation X, so I reflexively know everything is boring and stupid. Because that's my generational perspective, and you guys are way better than that. So generally what I favor is recognizing what the situation is, having that knowledge, knowing that it's not your fault, knowing it's not supposed to be this way, knowing that it's not you that is screwed up in some way, and moving forward from there. I like to sometimes close with a little bit of homework, easy homework, no papers due. In the next 24 hours, reach out to one person, maybe that you haven't talked with in a while, and ask how they're holding up, how their mental health is. It's not a question people often ask, but it's an important one. Just, text them, call them, see them in the hall, say, hey, how are you? Really, how's your mental health? There's a very good chance they'll say, fine, and they'll end the conversation. But they'll know that channel is open when they are ready to give an answer. And they have seen it then modeled that it's okay to ask. And maybe they'll just come out and talk to you about everything that's going on. And we'll just get through it together, you guys. All right, thank you. I'm going to leave these up for the Q&A just in case.
First of all, if there's any questions, I'm going to start off with a question, but you can think about what you might want to ask. My question relates to COVID, the pandemic, and maybe there's no connection here at all, but I'm just curious on your take on this. Is there any connection between, say, for example, how do I say it? The silly arguments we seem to be having about masks, the silly arguments we're having about vaccines, things like that. I mean, I'm sure those things might have happened anyway. Mm-hmm. Has mental health driven that in a way that perhaps is even, well, I don't want to say dangerous, but in another way, it made it more severe, made that tsunami more severe than it might have been otherwise?
I think there's a lot of fear in it, just as there is in treatment of mental health and treatment of mental health issues. People have asked me, why don't we talk more about mental health? What's the reason for the stigma? And I say, well, I think people are afraid because it's scary. It's super scary. This thing that I don't even know is gonna get in my brain and then just want me to be sad. Like, what evolutionary purpose is there to that? And it's scary when you don't know when you might catch something, because you don't know how to be on guard for it when it's invisible. And the same thing happens with COVID. You don't know that you're getting it. That molecule doesn't float across the room in a visible way. And I think what people do in that situation when they're scared is they group together. And so they'll group with whoever is proximate and like-minded. And for some people, the response to the scary reality of that situation is just to say that there's no elephant in the room. And I think it's a similar kind of thing. And denial's a really strong aspect. And also, too, like, if there's a panicky situation where you are, people are more likely to yell at each other. In my house, if someone's taking a shower on the second floor and they forget to put the shower curtain inside the tub, it starts to rain in the kitchen below. And then everybody's screaming and getting towels and, trying not to say nasty things to each other. But that's the instinct. So I think they have a lot in common.
Anyone else? Questions? All right.
None? I was so clear. Oh.
I'm glad you liked my award-winning tweet, by the way.
Oh, good. That was you. Thank you.
And it was Woodsy Owl in the 70s. I'm an X generation as well. I won't sing the jingle. John, you've done a really fine job of telling us you're not an expert, but you talk to a lot. So you have some real insights into this, I think. Those people who are strong, a lot of us turn to them. We identify them. And maybe some in this room, I would say, I would identify, but there's students in this room and others in this room. During this pandemic, someone has said to them, I appreciate that I can lay this on you, or something along that. What do you say to those people who take that on and take it in because they're identified as that and probably don't shy away from it? Where's their self-care? Where's that check-in? What should they be doing?
I think it's important, and I think as I understand the question, you're talking about, that sort of person who everyone goes to, to kind of lay it on them. And that person can be in a really tricky spot. I've had to be very, like, the emails that get sent into my show, they are screened before they get to me by my producer, because I get a lot of people writing in very earnestly and because they care, and I'm honored by what they write, but they write about the worst mental health situations of their life. And it's hard for me to read that without taking on what I've heard referred to as the psychic damage of it. I think what has helped me, because I would get emails from people saying, oh, your show saved my life. I wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the work you did. And I'd be like, well, that's quite something, and then I would think, what if I did a sucky show? Is everyone's life in my hands? But I think it's a matter of figuring out what it is you're providing for someone. If you're the person who everyone comes to lay things down, try to identify what it is about yourself that you're providing. And it's probably not the totality of your being. It's probably patient listening. Like, okay, I can provide patient listening, but I will not have to take on everything about this person. So when I asked a friend of mine who's a musician, John Darnielle from a band called the Mountain Goats, writes very personal songs about trauma, a lot of it. I said, John, what do you do? Because you must get these same letters of people saying you saved my life. And he said, oh, yes, don't worry, you didn't save their life. But what you did was you created a tool that they used to save their own lives. In my case, I created a podcast or a book that helped someone save their own life. And they're maybe in a situation where they don't recognize what a hero they are to themselves and that they are capable of saving their own lives. With John, it's music and novels. But what you can provide for somebody else, just make sure that you know it's a portion of yourself or an act or an aspect of yourself. And don't take on the burden of keeping that person healthy, because that's not your job.
Anyone else? Questions? Oh, of course. I don't want to trip.
Hi, John. My name's Kate, and
Hi, Kate.
I just wanted to let you know, and to everybody in the room too, that Clark University is a place where we really do talk a lot about wellness and well-being, and encourage people to seek the support they need. And it's a place where people notice, I think, when someone isn't okay, and they're not afraid to ask them. So I think that happens. But we have a student organization that just got started called Speak, and they meet Tuesday nights, and it's totally student-to-student led, where they talk about not having that stigma of talking about brain health, and they really are starting to support each other. So I just wanted any student in the room to know. They're Tuesday nights, 7 or 7:30. Bella Hannaford is the student who's leading it, and everybody is most welcome there. But I think it's important that people reach out to each other.
The power of stories just should not be underestimated. We're a story-driven culture, from the Iliad and the Odyssey to, the latest episode of Succession or whatever it is, Real Housewives. Stories that we tell each other of things that have happened to other people that aren't ourselves and have no direct bearing on ourselves. But that's where you find commonality. That's where you find that you're not alone. I mean, there's a reason why personal stories are at the heart of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an essential part to hear somebody else tell the story of what they've struggled with and how they've triumphed or how they've not triumphed. That makes us feel less alone, and that's using that power of connecting with other people similar to ourselves in a really positive way. On my show, I do some episodes that are about here are some video games that are new and really healthy and are based on mental health issues and are really fun. Or I'll do one about, what exactly is bipolar anyway. But the bread and butter of my show is here's a person who you may have heard of before, and here's the journey they went on. That's the whole topic. And the more you hear of those, the less alone you feel, and the more you feel oh yeah, I'm on a journey with a lot of these other people. And and I think too, we hide behind the word stigma sometimes when all we're really talking about is discrimination. People say, well, break the stigma, and it's often a matter of thinking that you know everything about a person based on who they, this thing that they happen to be that, or a situation that they're in that they have no control over. And so sometimes that's a helpful framing device as well.
I do want to say one thing I enjoy about your podcast is when you interview celebrities, people that, when I'm listening, people I think have made it. They're successful. And we often think, well, they couldn't possibly suffer from depression because they're successful. And I think that's one of the points that comes out is, well, no, this has nothing to do with success. It's something that it just happens to you. And I think that is one of the things that I think is very helpful when listening to those shows.
There's a story that happened when I was on virtual book tour for the book. I did a virtual bookstore appearance in Washington, D.C., and a friend of mine, Sean Doolittle, was pitching for the Washington Nationals at the time. They had just won a World Series. And Sean was like one of the star pitchers down the stretch for the Nationals. And when Sean got into baseball, he was a first baseman, got injured, and he had fielding balls was harder for him. So they said, why don't you go on up there and pitch? He hit like 90 miles an hour right away. They're like, okay, you're a pitcher now. And so Sean had been dealing with anxiety issues and depression issues since he was a kid. And he thought, if I could just make it to the major leagues, surely nobody in the major leagues is depressed. So he makes it to the major leagues as a pitcher. And he's like, if I could be the closer, like I'm a relief pitcher now, if I could be the closer, that means people are invested in me, that means I really count. Becomes the team's closer. If I could just make an all-star game, then I'll have the approval of my peers and the sports writers, and then that nobody who has that has any reason to be depressed. Makes the all-star team, still has issues. Maybe it's 2 all-star teams, because then I'll show that the first one wasn't a fluke. 2 all-star teams. Gets traded to Washington, and he thinks, surely no one who wins the World Series could possibly have these issues. Wins the World Series. And he said, John, then I read your book, and I realized I can't really achieve my way out of this. I better get some help. And he did. And that to me, that was my World Series when I heard that story from him, that he had made that realization.
Anyone else? Oh, okay, sorry. I gotta get away over there. Without tripping.
I bet their question will be, I'm told there were cookies.
There are cookies.
Vis-a-vis the cookie situation.
Here we go.
All right, so in this introduction, Michael, I just want to touch on a number of points before asking my question.
Okay.
But in the beginning, Michael noted how there's a certain connection that he missed in terms of seeing the expression on his student's face. And so we can see that there's a value in necessarily expressing ourselves to connect to one another. And I'm glad you touched on how the economic system is a bit complicit in this whole thing, and how it's it's designed to kind of disconnect us. We're commodified as people and just the lifestyles we live, and how all these different rates of mental illness, suicide, related to a lot of different things like isolation. So we're just very disconnected from each other. And how there's an emphasis on performance and profit instead of expressing ourselves and connecting to one another. But I just wanted to ask, so when it comes to these kinds of conversations, what kind of value would you see in placing a heavier emphasis on how the economic system is complicit in the perpetuation of trauma and mental illness?
Sorry, could you repeat the question a little bit? Maybe it's the mask I couldn't quite understand.
So when it comes to these conversations of mental illness, what kind of value would you see in placing a heavier emphasis on how the economic system is complicit in the perpetuation of trauma and mental illness?
I think it needs to be said. I think it needs to be shouted. and I think it needs to be demonstrated. We are in a society where we ask 3-year-olds, what do you want to be when you grow up? And the implication of that is, what job do you want to have? And the implication of that is, how do you want to trade your time and energy for the right to exist? Like, what kind of transaction would you like to arrange for, your toil? And I like to think other countries don't do that as much. I don't know whether they do or not. But I think I try to have faith in a breaking point, I guess, that situations like Amazon workers trying to unionize while their boss goes up into fake space will, if not necessarily make the streets run red with the blood of the bourgeoisie, at least some people realize that they're kind of being set up as cogs in a system, and have enough cognition and use the interconnectedness, use the availability of education and enlightenment, where things get so ridiculous on this side, increasingly ridiculous, and the education and alarm and refusal to put up with it comes to this point, and the good guys win. I have to have some sort of faith in the good guys winning in order to get up and go about my day. Good luck, students.
Anyone else? Well, okay, on that note, please join me in thanking John.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Clark. I appreciate it.
And yes, there are cookies outside, so please grab some cookies.